Hey everyone, and welcome to the finale of the Retro Text Adventure tutorial. I cannot wait to finish this up with you, and I'm excited. In this video, we are going to be making this side panel over on the right that will keep the information about the current room always present to the user, as well as telling them the help command that they can always use just to make sure that they can't lose any information. Let's get started. Okay, so in the previous video, we added all of this styling. We've got colored text, and we've got these colored backgrounds that help distinguish one command from another. But one thing that we're still missing, there's no way to ask for the room that you're currently in's description again besides scrolling back up to find it. And there's also no button to close or potentially open up a menu. And if you forget what the help keyword is, well, you either have to scroll up to the beginning, but if you've run out of room, that this message here is saying that you can type help might be deleted. So I don't know all that we're going to get to, but the basic gist is I want to add a little side panel to the right here that has the name and description of the current room you're in, a button to quit the game besides just having to type quit, and just a little help message at the bottom saying that you can always type help to get the available commands. So let's work on adding our side panel. So in order to add our side panel, I'm going to come into our game scene, our main scene here, scroll down to the bottom, and we'll see where we've got all of our UI elements, our background, margin container, rows, game info, which we've been working on the last few videos, and input area. And what I want to do is our rows element, this VBox container, right now basically stretches for the entire width and height of our background. But what I want to do is create a new side panel, and I don't want it to be part of the same VBox container because it's not going to be stacked vertically. It's going to take the whole height of our background, but I do want it to be a child of this margin container because I want it to have consistent margins with the rest of our UI elements from the background. It's nice to have this black border that we see and we have all around our box. So the way that I'm going to do that is make another child of our margin container, a HBox container that we will reparent, or we will actually make our rows to be a child of this new HBox container. So select our margin container, hit Command A, and we'll look for an HBox container. Oops, there we go. I'll add it. Let me drag this up. And I will call this, of course, columns, have to be consistent. And I will make our rows a child of columns. And now instantly, again, you will see that something's been affected. But the good news is that our columns takes up the entire width, which is good. And now for rows, we can just go to size flags and set the horizontal size to expand, and it too will take up the entire width given to it by its parent. So just in of itself, we haven't changed anything. If I run our game, we will get an error that we're going to have to fix because we have now changed the path in our scene tree to get to our game info and a couple other things. So we can fix that by adding, because it's now background, margin container, columns, rows, game info. We have to add columns because that's our new element. So add that to our node path up here. But besides that, now if we run our game, we should see that it both looks and works exactly like it used to. So that's a good start, just making sure that it's doing what it did before. And now we're ready to actually add our new side panel and do our formatting a little bit differently. So just like our rows here, we don't actually need our side panel to be a VBox container because it's just going to take up the whole width. So I'm going to add, as a child of columns, a panel container. And you'll remember this is exactly what we use for our game info and our input area. Let me minimize our rows here. And this is good. We want our side panel, which let me call it that. So side panel, this new panel container we added. We want this to come after our rows because I want it to be on the right side of our game at least. And again, you might feel differently than that. You might want it on the left. You could put it on the bottom or the top, whatever. But for me, I want it to be on the right side here. So I'm going to put it after our rows variable. Okay, so now we've got our side panel, but I want it to be colored the same as our game info area. And maybe we adjust it so it's not the same, but let's go into our game info. And if we go into our game info, this panel container, and go to our style, our theme overrides, and find our style box, we can copy this same style that we're using here. But because we're using it in a couple different places, I'm actually just going to save it so that we have access to it from our file explorer. So I'm going to save the style, this style box flat that we're using for our game info area, and just save it as main panel. And I'm going to use snake case for this because technically with resources, that's the proper naming convention. I don't always do that like for items and NPCs when it's basically a scene, and that's something I just kind of forget about. But ideally, you want to snake case your resources. So we'll call it main panel. This will be our main panel style, and I'm calling it main because the majority of important information panels in our game are going to use it. including our side panel. So if I come back to our game scene, let's select our side panel, go to theme override styles, and all we have to do is just drag in our main panel, this resource we saved, into our panel style. And all of a sudden we'll see that our side panel looks the exact same as our game info area. Now, one change we want to make is we see we've got this nice margin on the right side, just like we do on the left, but the margin between these elements is a little too small. So if we look at our margin container for our overall game, we have a margin of 20 pixels on each side. I don't think I want the margin between our game info and our side panel areas to be 20, maybe 10, maybe half of that amount, but let's experiment with some values and see. And the way we're gonna set that is by coming to our columns node, this new HBox container that we added. And if we go to theme overrides, you'll see that there's a separation constant here. If I select that at 0, then they will be merged together, but let's try doing 10 here. So remember that 10 is half of the value of our overall game's margin container. Just so that we can actually see what's going on, let's select our side panel, go to rect, and we'll just set a minimum size of, say, 64 in X, so 64 pixels wide. And that way we'll at least be able to see what our side panel looks like. Let's actually bump that up to 128. Okay, so now we have a bit better of an idea of what that's gonna look like. And I think because it looks like we're using the same margin down here between our game info and our input area, we probably wanna copy that same margin for in between these two. So let's adjust columns then to also be 20. And there we go. Now everything looks a little bit more consistent. It's kind of got that mosaic feel because it all fits together perfectly. So this is a good start. I think we have a side panel and it looks pretty good and it matches the style of the rest of our game. Okay, so now that we have our side panel, let's actually click on this, our side panel, and let's right click and select Save Branches Scene. So we can make it our own unique scene here. And I'm gonna select the scene button so we can go in and edit its own unique scene. And there are a few things that I want here. One, let's add a margin container because of course I want to not have our text butt up against the side. And for our constants here, let's try just doing 5 on all sides because that matches what we were doing in our game info area in the last couple videos, so it should look consistent. So now we have a margin container, and then let's add a VBox container because we want to stack a bunch of elements vertically here, and this will automatically take up all the available space, which is good. And so in my mind, what I want to add for my game, and again, feel free to add more elements on your own or experiment, etc., whatever works for your game. But in my game, there are a couple elements I'd love to get to. I don't know if we'll get to them all in this video, but ideally this is like what I'm imagining. We would have one, a quit button, like a little X in the corner. We would have a label that says current room is, or something like that. And then another label that would have the actual name of the current room. And then another label with the current room's description. And then finally our NPC and item list, so that even if you can't remember or can't find what room you're in and what's there, you can always see that information on the right side. So it's basically a panel that's going to tell us all of the important things about the room we're in, so we don't have to go fishing through our game info, our text history to find those items. And I think it's just a little bit clear, and we can also look at eventually maybe taking out some of those things like the room description from our game info so that we're not bombarded with so much text every single time we change a room. Just some ideas. Don't know what we'll get to, like I said, and again, feel free to experiment, but let's start by just adding some of these labels. So let's select our VBox container, which I will also call rows in the same style as what we've been doing before. Let's start adding some labels. And these can just be, for now, regular labels. They don't have to be rich text labels because we are not actually I'm going to be editing them from code or trying to like dynamically determine different parts. We'll just have them all be one color so we can use a regular label. And this will, let's say this first one is going to be a current room label. Let me also, in our theme override, add our font in here. Let's make this one Plex Mono 24. So not 28, because this is just going to say current room. So it's, or something like you are in, something like that. And then for the colors, let's make this the same color that our input history is. So if I come down to our input history scene and then look for our colors, we'll see the font color is, all right, it's 161. I'm just gonna copy this hex value here, just so it's a consistent gray. I like just using consistent colors across. If this was in a tutorial, you know, you'd normally have a style guide or something like that with consistent colors, a palette you're using. We don't really have that for this, but I'll try and be as consistent as we can. So we've got one label here that says you are in, and I'm going to add another label This one, I'm going to actually change the font. I just duplicated the first label, but I'm gonna make some changes here. So in our second label, let us change the font here to not be 24 pixels or 24 units, but we'll change it to be 28. So a little bit bigger. And I will also change the color and actually get rid of it. So it'll just be default white. And let's say a room. So this is what I want it to look like in our game. As whenever you change rooms, it'll say you are in, and then it'll always just have the name of the room. And then what I'm gonna do is let's add, okay, this is actually super hacky, but I'm gonna duplicate this label and I'm gonna get rid of the text and just put a space there. And it's really just gonna be a spacer. So I'm gonna call this spacer. We'll call this one info label, and we'll call this one room name label. So our info label is just constant. We're never gonna change it in code, but our room name label we will change. We also won't change our spacer in code. It's just a spacer. Now I'm gonna duplicate our info label because I want our smaller font. So duplicate that. I'm gonna drag this to the bottom, and this is gonna be the label where we put our room description. So let me call this room description label. And what I'm gonna do here is keep the font size, but just again, get rid of the color here so that it is white and easier to read. And then we'll just add some placeholder like this will be where the room's description goes. And just like the labels for our regular game info area, we wanna select auto wrap here so that it will wrap this text to match the overall size of our parent container, which is our side panel. And so just like that, all of a sudden we have a little side panel that's gonna say what room you're in, a little about the room, a kind of description here. And in a second, we'll be able to add NPCs and exits and all the other important information that our player needs to have. Before we do that though, let me actually go into our types script. So if I just come and find a script and go into our types, I'm gonna grab our location color here, this string without the hash, and just copy it. And now come back to our side panel and we can change our room name label's color to be just that color. And now this will be consistent again with the coloration we're using in the rest of our game. And I've actually been thinking about it. I do think for the, I mentioned this before, but I want to add underneath our room description now, exits, NPCs, and items, just like we have in our game, so that that information is displayed to the player. And I think we will actually use a rich text label for those, even though we won't do it for these first four labels. But we'll use a rich text label for the following list, just so that it's easier to use and it matches exactly what we are doing in the rest of our game. So let's add a new rich text label as a child of our rows object, and we'll call this exit label. And let me just, actually, let's set the settings we need to first. So first, fit content height, let's select that. And then we'll say BB code enabled, and we'll say exits. And then let's just do color equals, actually, we won't do this quite yet. Let's just say exits, and we'll say option, and we'll have to drag in our font here. And we've been using 24 for the rest of our side panel info. So let's use that again. So we'll select that. So we've got our exit label here. Let's copy this 2 times. So we'll have exits, then we'll have NPC label, and then we will have item label. I'm going to go through and just adjust the placeholder text in each of these just so we can kind of see from the editor what this is going to look like afterward. And I think actually for the sake of space, since we have more vertical space than we do horizontal, we might want it to be where our options actually come on the line underneath our kind of title. So it'll say NPCs and then options below it, and items, and then our options will be on the line below it. So let's try that, and again, we'll see how it goes and adjust as needed. I also want a little bit more space in between these items here, which you can do by coming up to our rows object and adjusting our separation. Let's try 10. All right, that spaces it out a bit. If I get rid of our spacer or just hide that, I think that's okay. I'll just keep it hidden for now. Actually, yeah, let's just delete it, and we'll just try this for now and see how it goes. So now we have our exit label, NPC, and item label. So we've got all the stuff here that we need. The thing we have to do now is actually just set up our code so that whenever we change rooms, all of this information is going to get edited. So in order to do that, let's come back to our main scene, our game scene here. And let's actually go into our command processor And basically what we need is whenever we call this change room function, we need to send this new room information to our side panel. But again, we want to keep our command processor and our side panel decoupled. They shouldn't know each other exists, and neither of their functionality should be determined or go away or be broken if one of them doesn't exist. So what we're going to do is actually add a new signal at the top of our command processor. So let me just create a new line, 2 lines below our top, and I'll say signal room changed. And this is going to have a parameter. It's going to pass in our new room. And so at the bottom here in our change room, let's actually emit signal room changed. And we will pass in new room as our new room parameter. And so now we're going to be emitting this signal, and it's going to be being sent out. Now we actually just need to wire up our side panel to listen to it. And to do that, we'll come back to our game scene here. And what we're going to do in our ready script is say command processor.connect, because our signal is on our command processor. So we'll connect the room change script. And then here we're actually going to connect it directly to our side panel. And because we're not going to reference our side panel anywhere else, for now I'll just use the $sign notation rather than making this an onReady variable. So I'll say side panel, I believe that's it. So we are going to connect this to our side panel, and we'll have a function there called handle room change. Now, the problem is that this function doesn't exist because we have no script on our side panel. So let's go back to our side panel scene, and we'll create a script and add it there. We'll just call it side panel. And then the only function we need right now is function. And I'll just copy and paste in the name of the function we set in that signal, which is just handle room changed. We know that this is going to pass in a new room, which will be a game room. And we've got to update our information now on our side panel based on this new room. And so in order to do that, there's a couple things we're going to need, which I'm just going to grab as onReady variables here because we'll be editing them every single time we change a room. I'll say onReady var room name, and I'm going to set this to be our room name label because we're always going to be updating that. The other thing we're going to need to update is our room description. So onReady var room description. And again, we're just going to set this to be room description. And now we're also going to need our exit, NPC, and item labels. So let me just do that real quick, and then I will fast forward to when it's done. Okay, so I've gone through and just added the onReady variables for each of those labels. And now all we have to do is just wire this up. And this is where I think we're going to find the way that we have coded our rooms and the way we've just made them modular and abstracted, and they just handle presenting their information the way they need to, is going to make this really easy. So all we have to do is say room name. And remember, this is a label, so we need to change the .text property here. And we'll just set this to be new room. And if we go into our game room, we'll say that we can just get our room name variable here. And we're going to be kind of hopping back and forth between these two scripts. So this is going to be room name. And then now we can do room description .text. Again, we're going to be updating our room description label to be new room .room description. Let me make sure it's room description and not actually, okay, it is room description and not just description. And now the really cool part is you might be wondering, man, it would be so cool if we could just get our exit, NPC, and item labels to automatically be formatted in the nice way that they are in our game and to use the same colors. And the good news is that we can, because we added our own we have our get NPC description, get item description, and get exit description. These are already functions that return formatted strings in our game room. And so we can just call right into these, and it's going to just work the way we need it to. And so I'm actually just going to call each of these functions and then set them in our side panel. So for example, for exit label, and remember our exit label is a rich text label, so we need to set BB code text and not just text itself. So we'll set the BB code text of our exit label to be new room.get exit description. And if we go to our game room, again, remember get exit description returns this formatted string. So we have get exit description, and we'll also need NPC and item description. So let's call those. Remember the names of these functions so that we can type them in our own side panel script. So I'll come back here. I'm just going to copy and paste this line 3 times and just adjust this to be NPC and then item label. And I'll do the same things here. Instead of exit, I will say NPC and then item labels so that they line up. And now all of a sudden, every time our room changes, we are going to be updating the text in our side panel. And so this is all well and good, and it's going to work whenever we change rooms, but we need to actually call this function right at the start of our game. And I think this should happen by default, because if you come into our game, when we say command processor.initialize here, and if we go into command processor and look at our initialize function, we'll see that we actually call change room in our initialize function. The problem is that we need to make sure this doesn't get called until after we connect the signal in our command processor. So if we go back to our game script, you'll see that we're actually connecting this signal after we call command processor.initialize. So we'll need to move line 16 up above to like line 12 or something like that. And that way we are going to be, actually, we'll just move this to the start of this ready script. And now anytime our room changes, even at the very beginning of the game, we are going to be updating our side panel's text to match our new room. So, moment of truth, let's run our game and see how it looks. So if I run it, we'll see that, hey, look at that. We've got a side panel and it's getting updated correctly. A problem though is if I start going somewhere, we're gonna see that the dimensions of our game and our side panel are gonna get all whacked up. So there's a couple changes we still need to make this work. One is that I think we forgot in our side panel to set our room name label to auto wrap. And what this will do is it will prevent our room name label from expanding our side panel size if we have a long room name. It'll just wrap it onto a new line. And I think that's much preferable to what we had before, much preferable to expanding our side panel. We kind of want that to be a consistent width. The other thing we can do is expand the width of our side panel. If we go to our rect and actually change its minimum size, and let's do 320, so a factor of about 3 there, 2.5, and this will just give it a nice basic width that it'll consistently take. And I think if we look at our game where it's all of our elements together, that's still a good amount of size. It looks like the right amount. Another thing we can do is we were previously just trying to see and make it work by adding this separation constant, but let's actually add a couple more VBoxes to format this better. So one, let's add a new VBox, and I'm gonna call this title section, because this is kind of just gonna be where we put the info label and the room name label. And so if we put them both under this title section, we can actually get rid of any separation, which will keep them close together. And then what we can do is you'll see that they're a lot closer together now, which looks good. And it takes up some of the, or gets rid of some of the wasted space that we previously had. And then one other thing I'm going to do is add another VBox container, and I'm going to call this list area, because this is where we're going to put all of our exits and NPCs and items, etc. And I'm dragging them under list area. And so now what we've got with our rows here is that there is a separation between these larger elements, but each category does not have that much separation between them. And I think this is going to look just a little bit better as we are editing this within our code. So now that we have this, I think we are gonna be doing a lot better in terms of how things look. But another thing we should do is that if we come into our side panel script and look at these functions that we're calling in our game room, we'll see that get exit and item and NPC description return an empty string when there is no NPCs or items, etc. We previously had another message like a there's no items here message that would show, but we got rid of that. And so what we can do on our side panel is actually hide our NPC or our item label if there are no NPCs or items, and that's going to save a bit of room. So what I'm going to do is say variable NPC string, and I'm actually going to set this to be our new room.getNPC description. So I'll cut that. And then I'm going to add an if statement here that says if NPC string equals the empty string. So if there's nothing there, then we'll say NPC label dot hide. So we're not even going to show it. And you'll see at the bottom of my screen here, we're getting all of these errors. And that's because we changed the node paths for a lot of our elements up here. So we're going to need to edit those in a second. But let's finish this if statement first. So if there's no NPCs here, if there are none, if the NPC string is empty, we'll hide it. Else, then we will do npc label.bbcode text equals npc string. That way we don't have to get it twice. Now let's copy this and do the same thing for our items. So I'll say variable item string, and it's going to look exactly, need an underscore there. And this is going to look exactly like the line above. So I'll do get item description here. We'll say if item string. Again, if this is the empty string, we will just hide our item label. So item label dot hide, and then here we're going to have an else statement, and this is where we're just going to set the bb to code text to be item string, which is our item description. So just like that, we are going to be dynamically showing and hide. Oh, actually, we also need to show and make sure that, if we hide our item labels, they'll never appear because we're never showing them if we move to a room where they need to be. So we need to say item label dot show here. And same thing with our NPC label. We'll just add a line here that shows it when we move to a room where there are NPCs. Okay, that was almost going to be a really weird bug. Now let's also go and fix all of these different paths up here. So mostly we added the exit NPC and item labels to this list area. So this is going to come after rows. So I'm just going to say list area. We're going to do this for all of these, list area, and finally here, list area. So now their paths work. We also added this title section for our room name label. So here it's just going to be title section. This is going to come after rows. So anyway, just making sure we have the paths right. If you forget to do this or don't have them right, your game will throw an error. So it will tell you, don't even worry about it. But anyway, now we should be dynamically updating, hiding, showing, making sure things fit. So if we run our game, we should see that the size, one, looks better and stays consistent as we play. One last thing we can do too, just to make sure things are the right size, is actually make our labels here something smaller. So we were just trying it out and it looked good, but I think we can actually make our side panel take a smaller font size. So let's adjust our info label from using 24. We'll just make it use the 16 now. And we'll make our room name label still take we'll move this to 24 as well. And this is going to be the big one. We'll change our description to now take our 24 instead of, it was 24. Let's make it 16 then. And again, it's going to be pretty small, but this will help the sizing. And for all of our three labels here, these two, we can change their fonts to go from the 24 to the 16. And this might be a little small, but just for the sake of sizing better. And another thing you can do with the sizing, if it's kind of weird in your game, is just increase the game's window size. You can do that in your project and then project settings in here. And that's a totally fine thing to do. I mean, if this was a game you were actually making, you'd probably run it full screen or just adjust your window size as needed. So we don't actually have to work this hard to make it fit. We could just make it run in a bigger window. But all that to say, these are just options that you have going forward. Okay, so now we've got pretty much everything we need here, but like I said at the beginning, I also want to add one more label that will just remind the player that they can always say help if they need to. Again, just a helpful note for the player. So let me copy our room description label, and I'm just going to call this the help label. Again, this is not something we'll be editing from code, but I'll drag this to the bottom here. And then what I can actually do is make our list area, actually if I go to our size flags, I can make it expand vertically, and then that means this will take up all of the available spaces that it can. And you can adjust this as needed. Like maybe you want your room description label to actually take up and expand its entire vertical size. Maybe you put that in another container. Again, you can make this look whatever you want, but I'm just gonna, for now, make our list area expand to take up all of the vertical space that it can, which will always keep our help label at the bottom of our side panel. And I'm gonna change our text here to say, you can type help for possible commands to see all possible commands. And I'll make that auto wrap also. I'm just trying to make this be formatted nicely. But I think that's good. Let's also, for this, just for the sake of coloration, we want to get as much mileage out of our colors as we can. I'm going to grab our system color from our global types file, come into our help label, and also set the color for this. Let me paste that in. And now it'll be that nice system orange that we see in other places. So now if we run our game, we will see, one, that our sizing is much better. Our text is a little small, but I don't think that's too bad. Again, we want the focus to be on our main area over here. But look at that. Look how nice it is that if I move around and resize, if I make it go full screen and make it come back in, that it just works the way it's supposed to. That Godot just automatically handles the layout for us. We've got our nice little help option here, so the player never has to remember what the command is, it always says, and the player never has to remember what exits we're in. Now, there's only one issue with this, which is if I go path and then go east and then go inside and then go south to the in kitchen, one, also look at the NPCs thing there, that looks really nice. So you'll see that if I'm in the in's kitchen that there's a key here, right? And if I say take key, it should update this and say there's no items anymore. Similarly, if I say something like drop key, we know that the key is now in this room. So if I say take key, etc., whenever a room is updated and you're in that room, it should probably update these lists on the side panel too. Now, again, we don't have a lot of dynamic gameplay, like we don't have NPCs moving from room to room, so this isn't a huge deal, but again, just for you guys, trying to make sure that I can show you ways to make your code as future-proof as possible and as extensible as possible, let's actually now finish up by just adding some handling so that when a room updates and you're in that room, this side panel will update with it. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is come back into our game scene here, and I'm going to go back into our command processor, and similar to how we had a room changed, I'm going to have a new signal called signal room updated here. And I'm going to say current room, I'm going to name that the parameter. And the idea here, I think, is that whenever an action is done, whenever the player types something, they take or drop, they talk, an NPC moves, an item changes, etc., but you're not actually changing which room you're in, so you're not calling room change, we will instead emit this room updated signal, which will basically tell the side panel, hey, you need to repopulate all of your information. We could be more selective and we could have like an NPC updated or item updated to make it a little bit more efficient, but we have so few NPCs and items that this little inefficiency is going to be okay. So this room updated signal, for now, the only two places where our room is going to update is when we take or drop. So if I come down to take, and in the success case where we actually take this item, we need to also emit a signal, and this is going to be room updated, and then we need to pass in current room. Again, this is where we could just pass in the item that's gone, but for now, we'll just pass in the current room and we will make the side panel actually recreate or regather the descriptions for the NPCs, items, and exits. So now we're doing this for our take. We need to also do it for a drop. I'm actually going to copy this line right here. And then in the success case for our drop, where we are adding an item to the room, I'll also emit the signal room updated with current room. All right, now we're emitting that signal. We come back to our game and we can wire it up. Similar to what we have here, I'm going to copy this command processor line that we added before. And instead of connecting the room change signal here, I'm actually just going to make it room updated. Now we're getting the node path for our side panel twice. So what I'm going to do is cut it out and just save it to a local variable only within our ready function, because again, we're not using it anywhere else, so we don't need to keep it in memory all the time. So I'll just say variable side panel, set it to be the node path for the side panel, and then I'm just going to change this to be side panel. I'll change the node path that we previously had here on this second connect function to also be side panel. And then because this is a room updated signal, I'm going to change this function name to handle room updated. And of course, because the parameter that room updated sends through is literally just the room itself, we could theoretically connect room updated to this same signal, room change, because in our side panel, remember, all this takes is just a room and it's just repopulating everything from that room. So it doesn't actually matter if this is a new room or just the updated version of a current room, it'll still work. But just for the sake of being clear, and in the case that we ever change this handling later, I'm still going to add this handle room updated function in our side panel. So let me copy this, come into our side panel script, and then I'm going to add a new function just called function, you guessed it, handle room updated. This is going to take in current room, and all I'm going to do here is just call our handle room changed. So this is really just going to be a pass through to call handle room change with current room instead of new room. So now that we have this, I should be able to run it and we'll see what happens. So let me run the game, and what I'll do is go west, go path. I have this route to the in kitchen memorized because of how many times I've typed this. Go inside, talk innkeeper, because why not? Hey, we spent a lot of time making these font colors, so we might as well enjoy them. So we'll go south after that little diversion. And now we should see that if I say take key, the key will disappear from our items list on our side panel. So if I say take key, boom, no more items. There's no more key. And if I say drop key, then all of a sudden there's a key there. So if I take the key and let's say I go to another room, a room that does not natively have this key, I can still drop the key, and now we see that there's items in the room. Man, everyone, this has been such a cool series, and I feel like we've accomplished so much, and we've made a text adventure game here that's easy to extend. It's got a lot of cool features, cool styling, cool things going on. I hope that you have enjoyed this journey, that this has been a helpful tutorial series for you, and that you feel like you've learned a lot along the way. I've definitely enjoyed getting to make it and hope you'll stick around for future videos that I'll be putting out. I'm sad to see it go, but unfortunately this is the last video that I've got planned for this series, as I want to move on to other things and make sure I'm putting out as much helpful content as I can. But if you have enjoyed this series, a like and subscribe to support the channel is always appreciated. We would love to have you in our Discord server. If you haven't joined, please join. Link is in the description below. And if you do find my work helpful, donating a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee, the link to that is in the description below also. That helps me continue to make great and free tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.